High in the mountains, where winter erases roads and silence swallows names, a man chose to live inside stone instead of running from it. They called him reckless. They said the mountain would take him. But when the storm finally came, when families were trapped, when fear had nowhere to go, the place everyone laughed at became the only place left standing. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Spring arrived in Silver Ridge the way it did in high country towns that sat too close to rock and sky, carefully, as if it had to negotiate with winter before it could step in. The mornings were bright but cold enough to sting the inside of your nose. By noon, the sun warmed the south-facing slopes and loosened the snow into a thin, relentless drip that ran off roofs, cut little channels along dirt roads, and pooled in the ruts where trucks had chewed up last autumn. The air smelled of wet pine needles and stone. At night, the temperature fell fast and the meltwater stiffened into ice again, turning every shaded corner into a quiet trap. Silver Ridge looked soft from a distance, spruce trees, pastel houses, and a ribbon of road winding through a valley. But up close, it felt like a place still half owned by the mountain. Elias Crow arrived in a dusty pickup that had seen better decades. He parked beside the only gas station on Main Street and sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel, as if he needed the contact to remind himself he was present. Elias was 41, lean in the way men got when they'd spent years hauling gear and walking long distances without complaint. His shoulders were square but not broad. The width came more from habit than muscle. He wore a faded field jacket that didn't match the season, and a ball cap pulled low enough to hide his eyes unless the light hit right. When he finally stepped out, you could see his face clearly. High cheekbones, a jaw that looked carved rather than grown, and the faint web of old sun damage across his nose. He kept his beard trimmed short, not for style, but for discipline. Like anything that grew unchecked might become a liability. A thin scar rode the edge of his chin, the kind that suggested an accident with metal rather than a fist. The first thing anyone noticed, though, wasn't Elias. It was the dog. Rook hopped out of the passenger side with the controlled ease of an animal trained to read rooms before entering them. He was a German shepherd, not the oversized show type with a dramatic slope, but a working build, compact chest, straight back, and muscle that sat tight against bone. His coat was sable, dark along the spine with lighter brown running into his legs and throat, and his ears stood tall as if they'd been shaped by wind. His muzzle was graying at the edges, and when he panted you could see the wear on his teeth. He was older, 9, maybe 10, and carried that age like a veteran did, not slow, but economical. His eyes were the color of strong tea, and they missed nothing. When a truck door slammed across the street, his head turned instantly, but he didn't flinch. He simply cataloged the sound and dismissed it. Elias took one look up and down the quiet street, then reached into the cab and pulled out a frayed leather leash. He didn't clip it to Rook's collar right away. He held it loosely, like a formality. Rook stayed close without being told. The gas station owner came out wiping his hands on a rag. Wade Sutter was in his late 50s with a round stomach and the posture of someone who'd stood behind counters for most of his life. He had pale skin that burned easily in this altitude and a mustache that was trying to go gray without his permission. His expression was wary but not unfriendly. Silver Ridge didn't get many strangers in spring, not when the roads were still unreliable and the tourist season hadn't woken up yet. "You passing through?" Wade asked, eyes flicking to the dog, then back to Elias. "Staying," Elias said. His voice was calm and low, shaped by years of speaking in places where volume could attract the wrong attention. Wade nodded slowly, taking in the truck, the tired gear, the lack of furniture, the dog's steady stance. "We don't have much for rent. Folks hold on to what's theirs." "I'm not looking for much." "That dog yours?" Elias glanced down. Rook's gaze remained forward, ears pricked. "Yeah." Wade's eyes softened a fraction. "He's got that look, like he's worked for a living." "He has." Wade didn't pry further, but something in Elias's tone made questions feel like a bad idea. Instead, he pointed with his rag toward the far end of town. There's a small cabin behind the old feed store. Belongs to a guy who moved down to Grand Junction. Might still be empty. You check with Marla Quinn at the county office. She handles the paperwork. Elias thanked him with a nod that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite dismissal. He filled the tank, paid in cash, and drove on. Silver Ridge's county office was a squat building with a peeling porch and a flag that snapped in the wind. Inside, the heat smelled like dust and old radiator water. Marla Quinn looked up from behind a desk stacked with folders. She was mid-30s, tall and narrow-hipped, with a sharp face softened by freckles. Her hair was a deep auburn pulled into a practical braid that fell over one shoulder. She wore wire-rimmed glasses and a denim shirt with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, revealing forearms that had seen both paperwork and real work. When Elias approached, she studied him the way people did in small towns, like they were reading your future and deciding where you fit. "We don't get many new registrations this time of year," she said, tone brisk but not cold. "Name?" "Elias Crow." She typed it into a battered computer that hummed like a tired animal. "You got a reason to pick Silver Ridge?" Elias hesitated, not because he couldn't answer, but because the honest answer never fit cleanly in conversation. He'd been a combat engineer. He'd spent years training his hands to build and break things. He'd learned to sleep in short bursts, to listen for the smallest shift in silence. He'd returned home with a head full of noise that no one else could hear. Places with crowds made his skin itch. Cities were too bright, too loud, too unpredictable. He wanted somewhere with clear lines and honest weather. "I like the quiet," he said finally. Marla's gaze flicked to Rook, who sat just inside the doorway without blocking it, posture alert but perfectly controlled. "And the dog?" "He likes the quiet, too." That earned the smallest curve of her mouth, more acknowledgement than smile. "Cabin behind the feed store is still vacant. It's drafty. Roof leaks near the stovepipe. Landlord's cheap because he's tired of it." "I can fix it." Marla nodded as if that confirmed something she already suspected. She printed forms, slid them across, and handed him a pen. "Sign here, and here. If you're planning on doing construction, town has rules. Not many, but some." Elias signed without complaint. His handwriting was neat, precise, the kind learned from forms that mattered. When he stepped back outside, the air felt sharper, and the sunlight had that high-altitude clarity that made everything look closer than it was. Rook rose immediately, matching Elias's pace like a shadow with weight. As they walked toward the truck, a small sound came from beneath the porch steps, an impatient, scratchy meow. A thin gray cat emerged, mottled like old ash. One ear had a nick out of it, and its tail ended in a blunt kink as if it had once been caught in something. It was small, probably young, but street-hardened. It stared at Elias with a look that wasn't fear and wasn't trust, just a blunt calculation. Rook's head turned. His body tensed, not aggressive, but ready. Elias touched 2 fingers lightly to the dog's collar, a quiet signal. Rook stayed. The cat took 1 step forward, then another, and stopped a safe distance away. It blinked slowly, like it was claiming the right to exist here without permission. Elias looked down at it, then back at Rook. "You're not the only one," he murmured, not entirely to the dog. Rook's ears shifted, catching something beyond them, wind maybe, or the distant crack of snow breaking free somewhere high above town. Elias didn't look up. He had learned long ago that some dangers you couldn't stop by staring at them. He opened the truck door. Rook jumped in. The cat remained on the porch, watching as if memorizing their shape. Silver Ridge's wind tugged at Elias's jacket as he climbed behind the wheel. The town was quiet but not gentle. It was the kind of place that would test you without warning, the way mountains always did. Elias started the engine and pulled out, heading for the cabin behind the feed store, toward a temporary shelter he could repair, toward routines he could build, toward a life that might someday feel like his again. And beside him, steady as a heartbeat, Rook rode on, because leaving was one command the dog had never learned to follow. The cabin behind the feed store sat exactly where Wade had said it would, pressed up against a low rise of rock as if it had tried, unsuccessfully, to borrow strength from the hillside. It was smaller than Elias had imagined, built of mismatched planks darkened by years of weather and neglect. The roof sagged near the stovepipe, and one corner of the porch leaned away from the house at a subtle but troubling angle. Meltwater dripped steadily from the eaves, tapping a slow, irregular rhythm into the mud below. The place smelled of damp wood and old smoke, the scent of something that had once kept people warm but had long since been abandoned. Elias parked the truck and sat still for a moment, listening. No voices, no engines, just wind sliding through the pines and the distant sound of water moving downhill. Rook jumped out first, circled the cabin with measured steps, nose close to the ground, then paused at the back wall where the earth met stone. He sniffed longer there, head tilted slightly, ears forward. Elias noticed. He always did. Inside, the cabin was worse. The floorboards bowed underfoot, and the air felt heavier, trapped. A single window faced north, letting in a pale, cold light that did nothing to warm the room. The stove was rusted through at the seams, and the chimney pipe had been patched with sheet metal and hope. Elias set his pack down and stood in the center of the space, hands on his hips, taking inventory the way he'd been trained to. He could fix the roof. He could replace the stove. He could reinforce the porch. But the problem wasn't skill or materials. It was the feeling, the way the walls seemed to creak too loudly, the way every gust of wind found a way inside. The place didn't feel like shelter. It felt like a compromise. Rook padded in behind him and sat, tail wrapped neatly around his feet. He looked up at Elias, then at the ceiling, then back again. It wasn't anthropomorphism. Elias knew better than that. But after years together, he trusted the dog's instincts as much as his own. Rook didn't like this place. Elias let out a slow breath. "We'll make it work," he said, though the words felt thin even to him. That night, he slept poorly. The wind rattled the loose boards, and every sound seemed amplified by the hollowness of the structure. He woke twice with his heart racing, hand already searching for a weapon that wasn't there. Rook lay pressed against the bed frame, solid and warm, a grounding presence in the dark. By morning, Elias had made a decision he hadn't realized he'd been circling since the gas station. He spent the next few days working odd jobs around Silver Ridge, clearing fallen branches from trails, repairing fences, hauling scrap metal for Caleb Moore, the town's unofficial handyman. Caleb was a big man in his early 50s, thick through the chest and arms, with a beard that had gone fully gray long before the rest of him. He moved slowly, not from laziness but from an old injury to his right knee that had never healed properly. A logging accident, years back. It had left him cautious, deliberate, and deeply practical. "You've got good hands," Caleb said one afternoon as Elias reset a warped gatepost. "Not many folks know how to read wood like that anymore." "I've had practice," Elias replied. Caleb grunted, accepting that as enough. He was the kind of man who respected work more than explanations. It was Caleb who mentioned the old hydro station. "Ever walk the upper trail past the quarry?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "There's an old access road up there. Leads to nothing now." "What used to be there?" Elias asked, though something in his chest had already tightened with interest. "Hydro project from before my time. They carved into the rock, ran turbines off the snowmelt. Didn't last. Too expensive to maintain. Place has been sealed up for decades, as far as I know." That night, Elias studied a faded map he'd found at the county office. The hydro station was marked with a thin black line disappearing into the hillside just north of town. He traced it with his finger, feeling the familiar pull of structure and possibility. Rook watched from the floor, head resting on his paws, eyes following the movement. The trail was rough, half choked with new growth and runoff. Elias moved steadily, boots finding purchase on wet stone, while Rook ranged ahead and back, alert but relaxed. The air grew cooler as they climbed, shaded by rock outcroppings that held winter longer than the valley below. When they reached the access road, Elias stopped short. The entrance was partially collapsed but not destroyed. A concrete frame still held, its edges worn smooth by time and water. Moss crept along the cracks, and a thin stream of meltwater trickled out, clear and cold. Elias crouched, running his hand along the concrete. Solid. He leaned closer, peering into the darkness beyond. The air that flowed out was cool but not damp, carrying the faint mineral smell of stone rather than rot. Rook stepped forward, paused, then walked in a few paces before turning back to look at Elias. He sat. The signal was unmistakable. Inside, the tunnel widened into a chamber where rusted machinery lay dormant, half buried in silt. The ceiling arched naturally, the rock cut cleanly and reinforced where needed. Elias shone his flashlight along the walls, noting the lack of fractures, the way water had been guided along channels rather than allowed to pool. It was good work, careful work, the kind done by people who expected things to last. He moved deeper, counting steps, measuring distances by habit. The temperature barely changed. He imagined what it would be like in winter, when the valley froze and the wind howled through town. Here, the mountain would hold steady, indifferent to the weather outside. They weren't alone. A figure emerged from behind one of the old turbine housings, hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. Jonah Pike was tall and narrow, with a shock of sandy hair that fell into his eyes and a beard that looked more like neglect than style. He wore a canvas jacket patched at the elbows and boots caked with mud. His face was sharp, all angles, but his expression was open, curious rather than defensive. "Didn't think anyone came up here anymore," Jonah said. His voice echoed softly off the stone. "I could say the same," Elias replied, keeping his tone even. Jonah smiled faintly. "I sketch, old places, keeps me out of trouble." He glanced at Rook, who stood calmly at Elias's side. "He's well trained." "He's a partner," Elias said. Jonah nodded, accepting the correction. "You thinking of fixing this place up?" "I'm thinking," Elias said truthfully. They talked for a while, about the station's history, about Silver Ridge, about the way the mountain seemed to swallow sound. Jonah mentioned he lived in a rented room above the bakery and came here for the quiet. Elias listened more than he spoke, cataloging the information, testing it against his instincts. When they finally stepped back into daylight, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the trail. Elias looked back at the entrance, at the way it blended into the hillside, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. That night, back in the cabin, the wind rose again. The boards rattled, the cold crept in. Elias lay awake, staring at the ceiling, while Rook rested his chin on the mattress, eyes half closed but alert. Elias thought of the tunnel, of stone and silence, of shelter that didn't argue with the elements but absorbed them. By morning, the decision felt less like a choice and more like a recognition of something that had already been true. Elias did not announce his decision. He simply began to move his life uphill, piece by piece, as if this were the most natural progression in the world. The cabin behind the feed store became a place for tools he no longer trusted and habits he was shedding. Each morning, he loaded the truck with supplies, timber salvaged from Caleb's scrap pile, coils of heavy-gauge wire, a cast-iron stove he'd bought cheap from a widow who no longer needed it, and drove toward the old access road. Rook rode beside him, muzzle resting on the window frame, eyes tracking the passing trees with the quiet focus of an animal who understood when something mattered. The hydro station greeted them with the same cool breath each time, air flowing outward as if the mountain itself were exhaling. Elias took that as a good sign. Inside, he worked slowly, deliberately, letting the space teach him what it would allow. He cleared debris first, shoveling silt and rusted fragments into neat piles. The work was physical and grounding, the kind that demanded attention without inviting memory. Rook stayed close, sometimes lying on the stone floor where the temperature never changed, sometimes pacing the perimeter with the solemn patience of a guard who knew no one else was coming. Elias mapped the interior in chalk, marking load-bearing walls, water channels, airflow paths. He talked out loud as he worked, not to fill the silence, but to test ideas against it. The mountain answered in its own way, with echoes that softened his words and returned them, altered, less sharp. By the third day, he knew where the living space would go, not deep enough to feel buried, but far enough in that storms would pass overhead without finding him. He marked a rectangle against the rock and stood back, imagining 3 wooden walls and 1 of stone. Shelter, not conquest. Partnership, not defiance. Word traveled, as it always did in small towns. Caleb came up one afternoon, leaning on a walking stick carved from juniper. He stood at the entrance, squinting into the dimness, beard catching the light like steel wool. "You serious about this?" he asked, not unkindly. "As serious as I've ever been," Elias replied. Caleb stepped inside, testing the ground with his boot, listening to the quiet. His knee ached when the weather shifted. Elias could see it in the way he favored one leg. "Hell of a place," Caleb muttered. "Stronger than that cabin, I'll give you that." Behind him came Nora Bell, a woman Elias recognized from the bakery. She was in her early 40s, broad-shouldered, with dark hair streaked prematurely with silver and pulled into a no-nonsense bun. Flour still dusted her forearms. Her face held the kind of firmness earned from long hours and early mornings, but her eyes were curious, sharp. "People are saying you're moving into the mountain," she said. "Figured I'd see it before I decided whether to believe them." Elias didn't smile. He showed her the drainage channels, the airflow, the way the stone carried sound. Nora listened, arms crossed, nodding slowly. "You know," she said at last, "my grandmother grew up in a sod house on the plains. Folks thought that was madness, too." She glanced at Rook, who sat calmly at Elias's side. "If the dog's comfortable, that counts for something." Not everyone reacted that way. Howard Blinn, a retired surveyor with a long nose and a voice that carried even when he tried to soften it, stopped Elias in town the next day. Howard was thin to the point of brittleness, his hair white and combed flat, his clothes always pressed. "You're risking a cave-in," he said, jabbing a finger toward the hills. "Old infrastructure fails. It's only a matter of time." Elias met his gaze evenly. "Stone fails slower than wood," he said, "and I'll know long before it does." Howard sniffed, unconvinced, but had no answer ready. He walked away shaking his head, leaving behind the faint smell of pipe tobacco. The real test came with the weather. A spring storm rolled in without ceremony, bringing cold rain that turned the access road into a slick ribbon of mud. Elias was inside the station when it hit, working on a ventilation shaft he'd decided to extend upward through a natural fissure. The rain intensified, drumming on stone overhead, the sound muted but persistent. Water flowed where he'd predicted, guided along channels and away from the marked living space. Rook watched the movement intently, ears twitching, but did not grow restless. Elias sat back on his heels and waited. He had learned, in other places and other lives, that waiting could be as important as action. When the storm passed, the interior remained dry. The air smelled clean, washed of dust. Elias felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. That night, he brought the stove up the mountain with help from Caleb and Luis Ortega, a young ranch hand with a quick smile and a wiry build. Luis was in his mid-20s, his skin weathered from long days outdoors, his dark hair cropped short for practicality. He'd grown up moving between states, following work, and had learned early to adapt without complaint. The three men wrestled the stove into place, setting it on a stone plinth Elias had prepared. When they lit it for the first time, the heat spread slowly, evenly, absorbed by the rock, and returned without urgency. Luis laughed softly, rubbing his hands together. "Feels like the mountain's helping," he said. Elias nodded. "That's the idea." As the days passed, Elias built the wooden frame, each cut precise, each joint tested twice. He worked with a discipline that bordered on ritual, checking angles, measuring distances, correcting the smallest errors. Rook lay nearby, head on paws, rising only when someone approached. The gray cat from town appeared one afternoon, slipping through the entrance with the confidence of a creature who believed it had always belonged there. It watched from a distance, tail flicking, then curled up on a warm patch of stone and slept. Elias let it be. At night, he still slept in the cabin, but the mountain pulled at him even in his dreams. He found himself waking with plans already formed, solutions half-built in his mind. The noise in his head, the old echoes of engines and alarms, grew quieter, replaced by the steady logic of stone and wood. One evening, Jonah Pike returned, sketchbook under his arm. He watched Elias work in silence for a long time before speaking. "You're not hiding," Jonah said finally. "You're building." Elias considered that. "There's a difference," he agreed. By the end of the week, the outline of a home stood inside the mountain, skeletal but unmistakable. Elias stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked at what he'd begun. It wasn't finished. It wasn't safe yet. But it was honest. Rook came to stand beside him, pressing his shoulder lightly against Elias's leg. Elias rested a hand on the dog's head, feeling the familiar warmth, the steady pulse of life. Almost, he said, not to the dog, not to the mountain, but to himself. By the second week, the mountain no longer felt like an intrusion into Elias's life. It felt like the axis around which everything else turned. The frame inside the old hydro station had grown sturdier, its lines clean and deliberate, timber meeting stone with a precision that reflected the man who built it. Elias worked from first light until his arms trembled with fatigue, stopping only when the ache sharpened into something that risked becoming careless. He had learned that lesson long ago. Carelessness cost more than time. The first window was the hardest decision. Elias stood for a long time with chalk in hand, studying the way daylight crept into the entrance and then faded, swallowed by the curve of the rock. Too close to the mouth and the cold would find its way in. Too far, and the light would be symbolic at best. He chose a spot where the stone narrowed slightly, where the angle caught the sun in the late morning. When he finally cut into the timber frame, the sound rang through the chamber, sharp and final. Rook lifted his head, ears pricked, then settled again when Elias's movements remained steady. As the window took shape, Elias felt an old tension rise in his chest. Cutting openings into shelter went against every instinct he had honed in uniform. In the field, openings meant vulnerability. They meant exposure. He paused, resting his forehead briefly against the cool stone, breathing until the memory loosened its grip. This was not a bunker. This was a home. The distinction mattered. The light that came through was modest, a pale wash rather than a blaze, but it was enough. It softened the edges of the space, gave shape to corners that had lived only in shadow. The gray cat appeared again, as if summoned by the change, slipping in and sitting directly in the beam. Its fur looked almost silver in the light, eyes half-lidded in approval. Elias shook his head faintly and went back to work. Ventilation came next. Elias extended the shaft he had marked earlier, drilling upward through a seam in the rock that angled toward the surface. It was slow, punishing labor, the kind that demanded patience rather than strength. Each strike of the drill sent vibrations through his arms and into his teeth. Sweat ran down his spine despite the cool air. He worked in short bursts, listening to the sound of stone, adjusting his angle when it changed pitch. When the drill finally broke through, a thin column of daylight spilled down like a promise. Fresh air followed, cool and clean. Elias leaned back against the wall and laughed under his breath, a sound he hadn't made often in recent years. Rook approached the opening cautiously, sniffed, then wagged his tail once, deliberate. Approval. The first night Elias slept inside the mountain was quiet in a way that felt deliberate rather than empty. He laid his bedroll on the stone floor near the stove, which glowed faintly, radiating heat that sank into the rock instead of vanishing into the air. Outside, the wind rose, scraping branches against one another, testing roofs and nerves across Silver Ridge. Inside, the sound arrived dulled, stripped of urgency. Elias slept for hours without waking, his dreams shallow and unremarkable. When he did wake, it was to the steady rise and fall of Rook's breathing and the faint drip of water far from the living space, moving where it was meant to move. In town, the shift did not go unnoticed. People had begun to adjust their routes to pass the access road, curiosity drawing them uphill. Some came with questions, others with warnings. Ellen Price arrived one afternoon with a basket of apples and a skepticism she did not bother to disguise. She was in her late 60s, small and wiry, her hair cut short and white, her back straight with stubborn pride. She had lost her husband to a winter accident decades earlier and had learned to mistrust solutions that sounded too clever. "You can't outrun the mountain forever," she said, setting the basket down. "It always collects its due." Elias nodded. "I'm not trying to outrun it." She studied him for a long moment, eyes sharp. "Good," she said finally. "Then maybe it'll leave you be." She left the apples and went back down the trail without another word. Jonah Pike visited more often now, sketching the evolving space with quick, confident strokes. He had begun to add notes in the margins, measurements, airflow arrows, the play of light at different hours. "You're changing how it feels," he said one evening, flipping through his pages. "It's less ruin, more intention." Elias appreciated that Jonah didn't romanticize it. He spoke of the work as it was, difficult, imperfect, necessary. The cabin behind the feed store stood empty by the end of the week. Elias hauled the last of his belongings uphill in the early morning, before the road grew busy with speculation. He left the place clean, patched the roof as promised, and set the key on the table. When he closed the door, it was without ceremony. Some chapters did not require a farewell. The true test came unexpectedly. A late spring cold front rolled in overnight, dragging sleet and high winds down from the peaks. By dawn, the valley was a blur of gray and white, the temperature dropping hard enough to shock. Elias was inside the mountain when it hit, reinforcing the doorframe with additional bracing he had decided, perhaps unnecessarily, to add. The wind howled outside, finding every weakness in the world above ground. Inside, the temperature held. The stove burned clean, drawing air up through the shaft without hesitation. No drafts whispered through the living space. Elias sat on a low stool, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, and listened. The mountain did not respond to the storm with drama. It absorbed it. Rook paced briefly, unsettled by the sudden shift, then lay down with a grunt, chin on paws. The cat vanished deeper into the structure, emerging hours later to claim a warm stone near the stove. When the storm passed, leaving behind broken branches and shaken nerves, Elias stepped outside. The access road was littered with debris, but the entrance stood unchanged. He felt a quiet certainty settle in him, heavier than relief, lighter than triumph. That evening, as the light faded and the mountain reclaimed its shadows, Elias stood in the center of the space he had carved and claimed. The walls were not finished. The floor was still bare stone in places. There was work ahead, always would be. But the essentials were there: light, breath, warmth, and silence that did not threaten. He rested his hand on Rook's head, fingers tracing the familiar line between the dog's ears. "This is it," he said softly. The mountain did not answer. It did not need to. Summer announced itself without ceremony, slipping into the valley on warm afternoons and lingering in the long light that stretched past dinner. Snow withdrew to the highest shadows, leaving behind a ground that steamed faintly at dawn and smelled of wet earth and sap. In Silver Ridge, people opened windows and spoke more easily. Up at the access road, the mountain remained cool, its patience unchanged. Elias settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than imposed. He woke with the light that filtered through the new window, brewed coffee on the stove, and stepped outside long enough to let his eyes adjust to the day. Rook ranged the perimeter, checking the same stones, the same scents, as if the repetition itself were a form of assurance. The gray cat appeared at unpredictable intervals, sometimes watching from the threshold with its blunt-ended tail flicking, sometimes vanishing for days. Elias stopped wondering where it went. Some things did not require explanation. The interior work turned toward details now, the kind that transformed a structure into a place someone could live without thinking about it. Elias laid a raised floor of reclaimed planks over stone sleepers, leaving narrow gaps along the edges to allow air to move. He sealed joints with a mixture of clay and fiber he'd mixed himself, packing it carefully until the wood met the rock without surrendering to it. The work demanded patience and rewarded attention. Mistakes announced themselves immediately. When he grew tired, he stopped. He had learned to respect fatigue not as weakness, but as information. On the fourth morning of the week, hoofbeats approached along the access road, measured, unhurried. Elias straightened, hand resting loosely at his side. Rook's ears came forward, but his posture remained calm. A horse emerged from the trees, a sturdy bay with a white blaze down its face, followed by a rider who sat deep in the saddle as if he belonged there. Marcus Hale dismounted with the ease of a man who had spent more years on horseback than off it. He was late 40s, broad across the shoulders, his beard trimmed close but not precise, peppered with gray. Sun had weathered his skin into something tough and creased, especially around the eyes. He wore the green uniform of the State Park Service, boots scuffed, hat pulled low. A scar ran from his left temple into his hairline, pale and smooth. Elias noticed it because Marcus noticed him noticing. "Morning," Marcus said, voice even, carrying without force. "I'm the ranger assigned to this section. Got a report of activity." Elias nodded. "That'd be me." Marcus's gaze moved past him, taking in the doorway, the window, the clean lines of timber against stone. He didn't frown. He didn't smile. He simply observed. The horse, Juniper, as Marcus later introduced her, shifted her weight and blew softly, nostrils flaring as she sampled the cool air flowing from the entrance. "You planning to stay?" Marcus asked. "I am." Marcus walked the perimeter with measured steps, touching the stone here and there, peering up at the ventilation outlet where it met daylight. He asked practical questions: drainage, fire safety, access in winter. Elias answered without embellishment. When Marcus crouched to examine the floor sleepers, he did so carefully, mindful of his knees. Elias noticed the stiffness in his movements, the way he favored his right side. Old injury, maybe. The kind that didn't announce itself until you asked something extra of it. "I don't see anything illegal," Marcus said finally. "Unconventional, sure, but you're not damaging protected land, and you're mitigating risk." He straightened and met Elias's eyes. "You'll need to register this as an occupied structure if you're staying through winter. Inspections, paperwork." "I expected that." Marcus nodded once, satisfied. His attention shifted to Rook, who sat at Elias's side, eyes steady. "K9? "Retired," Elias said. Marcus's expression softened a fraction. "They don't really retire, do they?" "No," Elias agreed. Juniper stamped a hoof, impatient. Marcus swung back into the saddle. "I'll file the report," he said. "If you need anything, tools, access permits, you come find me." When they were gone, the quiet returned, deeper for having been interrupted and accepted. That afternoon, Elias took a walk down into town for supplies. Silver Ridge had changed its posture toward him, subtly. People asked questions now that weren't warnings. Nora Bell waved from the bakery and handed him a loaf still warm, flour dusting her hands. Caleb offered a length of copper pipe he'd found in his shed. Even Howard Blinn, still skeptical, limited himself to a curt nod. At the feed store, Elias encountered Bethany Cross, a woman in her early 30s with a quick assessing gaze and a posture that suggested she was used to being listened to. She wore practical clothes and a notebook tucked under her arm. Her hair was dark, cut to her jaw, and her expression held the careful neutrality of someone who measured words for a living. "I'm with the County Emergency Planning Committee," she said, introducing herself. "We're updating shelter maps. Someone mentioned your setup." Elias didn't bristle. He had learned the difference between curiosity and threat. "It's not a public shelter." "Understood," Bethany said, "but understanding what works matters, especially up here." They talked briefly about airflow, temperature stability, the limits of the space. Bethany listened closely, jotting notes. When she left, she did so with a thoughtful frown, not of doubt but of consideration. Back at the mountain, Elias returned to work. He built shelves into the stone wall, anchoring them where the rock allowed, leaving gaps where it did not. He hung hooks for tools, for coats, for the small order that made daily life efficient. He laid out a narrow workbench near the entrance, far enough from the living space that noise would not intrude. Rook claimed a spot beneath it, chin on paws, watching dust motes drift through the light. In the evenings, Elias cooked simple meals and ate slowly, savoring the absence of hurry. He found that he no longer scanned constantly for exits. The noise in his head, once a constant static, receded to a manageable murmur. The mountain did not erase his past, but it placed it at a distance he could tolerate. One night, as the light faded and the interior settled into shadow, Elias sat with his back against the stone, eyes closed. He listened, not for danger but for continuity. Water moved where it was meant to move. Air rose and fell. The stove ticked softly as it cooled. Rook's breathing anchored the space. The cat emerged briefly, stretched, and vanished again. Elias realized then that the quiet was teaching him something he had not learned elsewhere: how to be present without vigilance, how to exist without bracing for impact. The mountain did not demand that he forget. It asked only that he pay attention. He stood, banked the stove, and checked the door one last time. Outside, the valley lights blinked on, distant and small. Inside, the space held. "This will do," he said quietly. And for the first time since he'd arrived in Silver Ridge, the words felt complete. The first sign was not sound, but instinct. Rook rose from his place beneath the workbench and stood rigid, Head lifted, ears angled toward the deeper reaches of the mountain. His tail was still, his body held in that particular tension Elias had learned to trust long before alarms or orders. Elias paused mid-task, one hand braced against the stone shelf he was installing, and listened. At first there was nothing, only the familiar steady breathing of the space. Then came a subtle tremor, not enough to shake tools loose, but enough to alter the way dust lifted from the floor. A low vibration followed, felt more than heard, like distant thunder carried through solid matter. Elias straightened slowly, heart rate climbing without panic. He knew this sensation. He had felt it before, in places where the ground decided to rearrange itself without consulting the people living on it. "Easy," he murmured, not to Rook, but to himself. The vibration grew into a muted roar as something massive shifted high above the access road. Stone scraped against stone. Somewhere outside, gravity took over. Elias moved with practiced economy. He checked the ventilation shaft first, watching the flame of the lamp he kept there. It burned steady. Airflow remained clean. No sudden pressure change. Good. He secured the door, reinforcing the internal brace he'd installed weeks earlier. Rook followed, close but unobtrusive, nails clicking softly against the floor. Then the sound reached its peak, a rolling, relentless thunder as a section of scree broke free from the upper slope. The mountain did not explode. It flowed. Rock and earth slid downward in a grinding cascade, carrying brush and dead timber with it. The impact passed overhead and beyond, shaking the structure just enough to announce its presence. Elias planted his feet and waited, hands splayed against the stone wall, feeling the vibration dissipate into something manageable. It lasted less than a minute. When it ended, silence rushed back in, heavier for the interruption. Elias exhaled. Rook relaxed incrementally, tail lowering, ears flicking once as he reassessed the world. The cat, who had vanished at the first tremor, did not reappear. Elias stepped outside cautiously. The air smelled raw, freshly exposed earth mixing with pine sap. A section of the access road had been buried beneath a fan of rock and soil, cutting off the clean path down to town. Dust hung in the sunlight like a veil. Elias scanned the slope, reading the new lines carved into it. The slide had missed the entrance by yards, diverted by a natural buttress of stone. The mountain had chosen its path carefully. Down in Silver Ridge, the effect was immediate. Sirens wailed briefly, volunteer responders rousing themselves into motion. Elias heard engines, voices carried faintly uphill. He returned inside long enough to gather gear, rope, shovel, pry bar. He clipped Rook's harness into place, checking the fit with a quick practice tug. "Search," he said quietly. Rook moved ahead, nose down, tracking along the edge of the debris field. Elias followed, testing each step before committing his weight. The slide had stopped short of the lower houses, but the access road was impassable. Someone would need help clearing it. They met Tom Alvarez halfway down, scrambling uphill with a radio clutched in one hand. Tom was in his early 30s, stocky with a thick black beard and eyes that never seemed to stop moving. He worked maintenance for the town and volunteered with search and rescue when needed. A childhood accident had left him with a slight limp, but it had also taught him how to compensate, how to read terrain carefully. "Road's blocked," Tom said, breathless. "No injuries reported yet, but old Mrs. Denton's shed went down the slope. We're checking." "I'll help," Elias said. They worked methodically, Rook weaving ahead, signaling when the ground felt unstable. The dog's age showed in the careful placement of his paws, but his focus was absolute. When they reached the shed, collapsed but empty, Elias felt the tension ease slightly. No trapped voices, no movement beneath the wreckage. By the time Marcus Hale arrived on Juniper, the situation was under control. Marcus surveyed the damage with a grim set to his mouth, dismounting stiffly. "You all right?" he asked Elias. "I am," Marcus nodded, eyes flicking to the intact entrance above. "Looks like you picked your spot well." Clearing the road took the rest of the day. Elias stayed until the worst of the debris was shifted enough to allow foot traffic. When he finally headed back up, exhaustion settled into his bones. Not the frantic fatigue of crisis, but the honest weariness of work completed. That night, the mountain was quieter than usual, as if settling after exertion. Elias sat at his small table, hands wrapped around a mug, and took inventory. No damage inside, no cracks. The ventilation held. The shelves remained anchored. He slept deeply, undisturbed by dreams. The following morning brought visitors. Bethany Cross arrived first, notebook already open, boots dusted with dried mud. She listened as Elias explained what he'd observed, the path of the slide, the way the rock had diverted. She asked precise questions, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This could change our hazard maps," she said finally. "Your place acted like a buffer." Elias shrugged. "The mountain did what it always does. I just didn't get in the way." Later came Ellen Price, apples replaced by a thermos of coffee. She stood at the entrance looking out over the altered slope. "Lost my husband to a slide not far from here," she said quietly. "He thought he could outbuild it." Elias met her gaze. "I'm not trying to outbuild anything." She nodded once, accepting the distinction. She left the thermos and went back down without ceremony. As the day wore on, more townspeople stopped by, not to gawk, but to understand. Caleb brought extra timber. Nora Bell sent bread again, this time with a note tucked inside. Even Howard Blinn appeared, standing at a distance, studying the rock with narrowed eyes. He didn't speak, but he stayed longer than Elias expected. That evening, Jonah Pike arrived with charcoal smudged across his fingers. He had sketched the slide, capturing its motion in dark, sweeping lines. "You stayed," he said, not accusing, not praising. "I knew where I was," Elias replied. When the light faded, Elias walked the perimeter one last time. The mountain stood altered but intact, its scars already beginning to soften. Rook moved at his side, tired but satisfied. The cat reappeared briefly, emerging from a crack in the stone, then curled near the stove as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Elias lay down, listening to the familiar sounds return. He understood now that safety was not the absence of movement or danger. It was knowing how to read the world when it shifted. The mountain had moved. He had not. Autumn did not arrive in Silver Ridge all at once. It crept in through the margins, cooler mornings, the smell of iron in the air, aspens turning the hillsides the color of old coins. Up at the mountain, the change was more deliberate. Shade returned early in the day, and the light that filtered through Elias's window carried less warmth, more clarity. The mountain was practicing for winter, and Elias took the cue seriously. Preparation became the work of the season. Not construction, those days were largely behind him, but refinement. Elias added a secondary air baffle near the living space, a simple panel that could be adjusted to slow circulation when temperatures dropped. He built a narrow vestibule just inside the door, a buffer against cold air, framing it carefully so the stone could still do its work. Rook watched these changes with quiet interest, sometimes nosing a plank into place as if offering an opinion. The cat observed from its preferred stone, eyes half closed, unimpressed by human diligence. Firewood stacked quickly once word spread. Caleb arrived with a trailer of split juniper, grimacing as he climbed down. "Knees barking," he said, not asking for sympathy. Elias unloaded the wood without comment, stacking it in a way that allowed air to move freely. Nora Bell sent sacks of flour and dried fruit, claiming it was excess, but watching Elias's reaction too closely for that to be true. Bethany Cross stopped by with updated maps and questions about airflow in prolonged cold snaps. The mountain home was becoming a point of reference whether Elias wanted it to be or not. The most unexpected visitor came on a clear afternoon when the sky looked deceptively gentle. A woman climbed the access road alone, moving steadily but with visible effort. She paused often, one hand braced against her thigh, breathing through the strain. When she reached the entrance, she stood for a moment, gathering herself. Her name was Rachel Monroe. She was in her late 30s, tall but slouched slightly as if accustomed to making herself smaller. Her hair was blonde, cut short at the nape, with a streak of darker color running through it that suggested a long-ago decision rather than neglect. Her face held a tired strength, fine lines at the eyes, a jaw that tightened when she spoke. She wore a jacket too thin for the altitude and boots that had seen better days. "I was told you might talk to me," she said, voice level but careful. Elias waited. My brother, Rachel continued. He's up north, works seasonal logging. He doesn't listen when people tell him to slow down. After the slide last week, I thought maybe you'd have advice. They walked the perimeter together, Elias explaining what he looked for in stone, in slope, in sound. Rachel listened intently, asking questions that revealed she wasn't seeking reassurance, but understanding. When she spoke of her brother, there was frustration there, but also fear she kept tightly leashed. You can't make someone respect the mountain, Elias said finally. You can only show them what respect looks like. Rachel nodded, absorbing that. She left with a list Elias had written, simple, practical steps for winter assessment, and a promise to return if she needed more. As she went down the trail, Elias noticed the way her shoulders eased slightly, as if carrying the information had lightened something. That night, the wind rose without warning. It rattled branches and sent a low howl across the slopes. Inside, the space held steady. Elias lay awake anyway, not from fear, but from memory. There were nights when the sound of wind in confined spaces still folded time back on itself. He sat up, breathing slow, grounding himself in the present. Rook lifted his head, eyes searching Elias's face. Elias placed a hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling the warmth and solidity there. It's now, he said quietly. Rook settled. The first snow came early, a light dusting that softened edges and rewrote familiar paths. It melted by noon, but the message was clear. Winter would not be late this year. Marcus Hale returned on Juniper for a scheduled inspection, bundled now in heavier gear. He dismounted stiffly, rubbing his hip before he realized Elias had noticed. Old injury, he said, preempting the question. I took a fall years back. Makes me plan ahead. They walked through the space together. Marcus checked clearances, fire safety, emergency exits. His questions were sharper now, his tone less exploratory and more collaborative. We're setting up designated winter shelters, he said. Not official ones, more like known safe points. Elias considered that. I don't want this crowded. Marcus nodded. Understood. But knowing it exists matters. They stood at the entrance, watching clouds gather over the peaks. You're not just living here, Marcus said. You're setting a precedent. I didn't mean to. Most useful things start that way. The training session happened a week later. It was informal, announced by word of mouth rather than posters. A dozen people showed up. Caleb, Bethany, Tom Alvarez, a few younger folks who worked seasonal jobs and wanted to learn something that might keep them alive. Elias walked them through hazard recognition, basic shelter assessment, what to listen for when the ground shifted. He did not lecture, he demonstrated. Rook assisted when asked, showing how he read terrain with his nose and ears. The dog moved slower than he once had, but his precision remained. When it was over, no one applauded. They simply stayed a while, talking quietly, absorbing the space. The gray cat watched from its stone, unimpressed by community milestones. As autumn deepened, Elias noticed something else changing. He no longer flinched at sudden sounds. He slept through most nights. The mountain did not cure him, it calibrated him, it gave him scale. On the last clear day before the season turned in earnest, Elias walked the ridge above the access road. He stood where he could see both the valley and the slopes that fed into it. Snow clouds gathered to the west, their edges already fraying into gray. Rook stood beside him, older now, muzzle more silver than sable. The dog's movements were slower, but his attention remained fierce. Elias knelt and rested his forehead briefly against Rook's, a gesture that belonged to them alone. "Ready?" Elias asked. Rook's tail thumped once. As the first true snowfall began, thick, deliberate flakes that did not melt, Elias returned inside. He secured the door, adjusted the air baffle, and banked the stove. The light through the window dimmed, then vanished entirely as snow accumulated outside. Inside, warmth held. Air moved as it was meant to. The mountain settled into itself. Elias sat at his table, hands steady, and wrote a short list for the coming months: maintenance checks, food rotation, fuel assessment. It was not fear that drove the list, but respect. Winter was coming. He was ready. Winter arrived not with drama, but with certainty. Snow fell for 3 days straight, steady and unrelenting, until Silver Ridge became a quieter version of itself. Roads narrowed into pale corridors, fences vanished beneath drifts, and sound softened as if wrapped in cloth. The mountain absorbed it all without comment. Inside the stone, Elias felt the season settle like a held breath finally released. The first weeks passed in a pattern Elias had rehearsed in his mind long before the cold arrived. Each morning, he checked the ventilation, the stove, the door seals. He rotated food, melted snow for water when the seep slowed, and logged small changes in a notebook Bethany had insisted he keep. Rook moved more slowly now, his joints stiff in the mornings, but his awareness never dulled. He chose his resting places carefully, favoring stone that held warmth longest, and rose whenever the mountain's voice shifted even slightly. The gray cat adapted without instruction. It learned the boundaries of warmth and cold, appearing only when the stove was lit and retreating deeper into stone when it was not. Elias never named it. Some companions did not require labels to remain. Down in the valley, winter pressed harder. A mid-January storm brought wind strong enough to peel siding from older houses and bury secondary roads overnight. Power flickered and failed in sections of town. The volunteer crews worked until exhaustion dulled their judgment. The call came just after dusk. It was Bethany Cross on the radio, her voice tight but controlled. "We've got a problem on the north end. 2 families stranded. Road access is gone. 1 medical issue, possible hypothermia. We need a stable point." Elias did not hesitate. "Bring them up," he said. "I can hold them." There was a pause. "You're sure?" "Yes." He prepared the space with deliberate speed, moving benches, laying extra bedding, adjusting airflow to account for more bodies. The stove burned hotter now, the mountain absorbing and returning the heat without complaint. Rook watched every movement, alert but calm, as if this were simply another exercise he'd trained for long ago. They arrived an hour later, emerging from the storm in pairs, faces red with cold and fear. Daniel Price, Ellen's nephew, came first, carrying his wife Lena, who was pale and shaking, her breath shallow. Daniel was mid-30s, tall and raw-boned, his beard thick with ice, eyes wide with worry. He'd grown up in Silver Ridge and thought he knew winter. This one had reminded him otherwise. Behind them came a young couple, Aaron and Molly Keene, barely out of their 20s, bundled in mismatched gear, eyes darting as they took in the stone walls. Aaron was broad-shouldered but tense, jaw clenched as if bracing for judgment. Molly clutched a small pack to her chest, her dark hair plastered to her face, fear giving her movements a brittle edge. Elias directed them without raising his voice. He placed Lena near the stove, wrapped her in blankets, and checked her pulse with practiced hands. He'd seen worse. He'd seen better too. What mattered was that she was here now. Rook lay nearby, radiating warmth. The cat vanished. Hours passed. Outside, the storm screamed itself hoarse. Inside, the air remained steady. Elias spoke only when needed, conserving energy, offering reassurance without false promises. Daniel watched him closely, something like awe and guilt fighting behind his eyes. "I didn't believe it," Daniel said quietly at one point. "What you built." Elias did not look up. Belief doesn't change weather. By morning, the storm broke. The world outside emerged buried but intact. Lena's color returned slowly, her shivering eased. When Marcus Hale arrived on Juniper with a small rescue team, his expression shifted as he took in the scene, not surprise but recognition. "This place held," Marcus said. "It was meant to," Elias replied. The families left by midday, exhausted but alive. Daniel clasped Elias's forearm with both hands, grip fierce and grateful. Molly hugged the cat when it reappeared, startled laughter breaking through her fear. When they were gone, the space felt larger, quieter again. Elias cleaned methodically, restoring order without erasing the evidence of what had happened. Rook followed him, then settled with a heavy sigh near the stove. That night, Elias sat with his back against the stone, listening to the mountain resume its steady silence. He felt no triumph, only alignment. Spring returned months later, slowly and without ceremony. Snow retreated inch by inch, revealing the valley anew. Grass pushed through where it could. Roads reopened. Life resumed. Silver Ridge had changed, not dramatically, not completely, but subtly, in the way people chose shelter, in how they spoke of the mountain, not as something to conquer, but something to work with. Marcus formalized winter safe points, quietly modeling them after Elias's design. Bethany updated the county maps. A few families began reinforcing their homes with stone and earth, borrowing principles Elias never claimed to own. Elias did not move. He planted a small pine near the entrance, its roots nestled carefully where stone would protect rather than crush them. He watched it daily, gauging its resilience. Rook aged more noticeably as the month passed. His muzzle whitened fully, his steps shortened, but his eyes remained clear. On a mild spring afternoon, he lay in the doorway, half in light, half in shadow, breathing slow and content. Elias knelt beside him. "You did good," he said, voice rough. Rook's tail thumped once. When Rook passed later that year, it was quiet, no struggle, just a long exhale and stillness. Elias buried him above the access road, where the sun reached longest, and the mountain watched over everything below. He marked the place with stone, nothing more. Years passed. The mountain home endured. It weathered storms and seasons, its stone unchanged while the world around it shifted. People came to see it, not as a curiosity, but as an example, a way of listening before building, of choosing endurance over display. Elias grew older there, quieter, lighter. On clear mornings, he stood at the entrance and watched the valley wake. On evenings, he banked the stove and read by fading light. The pine grew taller. The mountain remained. He had not disappeared into the stone. He had found his place within it. Sometimes, miracles do not arrive with thunder or blazing light from the sky. Sometimes, they come quietly. In a place of shelter when every road has disappeared, in a hand that chooses to open when fear tells others to close their doors. God may not always stop the storm, but He places the right person in the right place at the right time. A heart patient enough to listen, a home strong enough to protect, a small decision that ends up saving many lives. In your own life, you may be facing a storm right now. You may feel too small, too tired, or too alone to make a difference. But remember this: God often works through the simplest things. A quiet act of kindness, a choice made with courage, a perseverance no one else sees. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from, or write a short prayer for yourself or for others. And if you believe that no child or animal should ever face fear alone, subscribe to the channel and help spread stories that carry light. May God bless you and your loved ones. May He grant you peace in the middle of every storm, and may He guide you to the shelter He has prepared for you, even when it begins with a single quiet step of faith.